Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, August 29th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 8 and the 43rd webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I'm turning this webinar over to him now. Neil.
Thank you, Bob. We've had about a 3-week pause in between because of various scheduling difficulties. The immediately preceding webinar was on the 1st of August. Here we are on the 29th. I'm mistaken. The preceding webinar was on the 8th of August. In any case, welcome. I'm glad to be with you. I'm glad to be with all of our participants. We are indeed continuing our series of webinars on the topic that Bob announced. The document that we are going to consider today is called Living the Real Religion of Jesus. This is a document that I wrote in the middle of last year. It is, in effect, an addendum or a supplement to the much longer document, Revelation Revealed, that I wrote in the middle of 2016. For those of you who may not have been following our series, I recommend very strongly that you download at least the short document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. Both documents, Living the Real Religion of Jesus and Revelation Revealed, are available on the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. And the citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. In this citation, the word global endeavor is treated as if it were a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. Now, because you are not able to ask us questions as we go along, we offer you the option of sending us in a question, or maybe more than one, by email. If you wish to do that, you would use the email address at the bottom of the homepage of the Committee for the Global Endeavor, the citation I gave you earlier. And the email address is simple. It is info@globalendeavor.net. If you send us a question and we decide to use it during a future program, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And if we do use it, then you would get an answer from all participants that day, not just from me personally. So now, having made the basic announcements on a procedural level, I would state that we are going to depart from our usual practice. Our usual practice is to go paragraph by paragraph, and in some cases, sentence by sentence. We concluded the document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, on that basis during the last webinar. And now we are going to review it as a whole. It is 18 pages. And so the idea here in front of the panel is to comment on the document as a whole and whether it succeeds, and if so, to what degree, in portraying the real religion of Jesus. So the first segment of the document is called Finding God for Oneself, which is located on pages 1 and 2 of the document. The highlight, in my opinion, is a quotation from section 9 of paper 195 by the Midwear Commission, which reads as follows, and this quotation appears at the end of the first paragraph of the document. It reads, "The religion of Jesus does indeed dominate and transform its believers, demanding that men dedicate their lives to seeking for a knowledge of the will of the Father in heaven, and requiring that the energies of living be consecrated to the unselfish service of the brotherhood of man," unquote. Now that's the end of that quotation, but what I'm looking for is a general view of these 2 pages, which are in the section labeled Finding God for Oneself, whether they succeed in describing the essential point. Andre, would you like to be the first to answer that?
Seems like a rhetorical question, Neil.
Well, if you don't want to, I can hand the ball to somebody else, but I think that would be a little bit embarrassing for you.
No, yes, enough said.
Mhm.
You know, I agree with you. I think this does succeed in speaking to that. Uh, the quotes and whatnot, the general discussion does actually address this idea, and that particular quote that we just read, that you just read, Neil, I think is salient in that it really underscores the value of religion as a living experience, and that if a religion so called, um, meaning a religious way of life, does not dominate the life, then it's not succeeding. And I think you've succeeded in uh, describing that. At least I think we succeeded in having very good discussions on that. The only other thing I guess I would talk to is this idea of how it can be part of an evolution. And that's covered in that next quote that you have there, and particularly this passage. And so may you pass from death to life, from the authority of tradition to the experience of knowing God. Thus will you pass from darkness to light, from a racial faith inherited to a personal faith achieved by actual experience. And thereby will you progress from a theology of mind handed down by your ancestors to a true religion of spirit, which shall be built up in your souls as an eternal endowment. That's from 155.6, paragraph 3. Now, what's interesting about that for me is it really encapsulates the idea that Jesus never, in pronouncing what a religious life should be, ever expected that his chosen apostles should be bootstrapped into that kind of religion. He understood that this was going to be an evolutionary process, that the idea of you may have a conversion that leads you to wanting to have a personal relationship with God, but that realization and that outworking in an art of living in oneself happens gradually. It happened in the realization of the apostles. It's happened for all of us in our evolution, to before we found the fifth epical revelation, and has happened, I would say, I would hazard a guess, for all of us in our evolution with this revelation. There's no way to discard what you learned. It's more a matter of learning something else which can then gradually supplant what you may have learned before traditionally.
Thank you. George, I would like to turn to you next. And it seems to me that Andre has very helpfully highlighted the idea of intense activity, that the religion of Jesus in abstract sense, and also I think is portrayed on these 2 pages of my essay, requires an active engagement, a level of energy, not just sitting back and being preached to. What is the point of persuasion that can be applied to human beings in general that may induce them really to be active in seeking for God instead of merely sitting back and letting it fall upon them out of the mouths of other human beings?
Um, so you're asking what would motivate people?
That's part of the question. And
That's
if you want to comment in other regards, that's purely up to you.
well, that's a very deep question. In fact, I don't think any question gets any deeper than that question. I don't know how to address how to motivate people spiritually. So I think the statements, the citations that you presented make a good case for it. but you know, those are just words. I mean, how do you how does that get translated into action? That's the question. So I don't think I can really answer your question except to say I don't know.
Well, if I will be completely honest with you, George, as I always strive to be, I don't know either. The problem we have is that human beings have very different levels of receptivity and activity. People are willing to spend hours and hours swinging a golf club if they happen to be a golfer, or going to bowling alleys and practicing their throw at bowling. But devoting time to searching for God in activity is, let's just say, a harder sell. And some people are willing to do it and others hesitate very much. Francois, can we take that question as the paradigm for this section? Does the section convey the idea that activity is the essential requirement of Jesus's real teachings?
Yes, of course. And I think in your paper, it's a very good thing that you put the warning first. Okay, so it's a way to tell, if you don't want your life dominated and transformed, go elsewhere. Don't read that. Okay, because the real religion of Jesus is something that imply all the personality. It's a move of finding God for oneself. Who's oneself? It's the entire person. So it's not something just the Sunday. It's 7 days a week, and you will be. If you're afraid to be transformed, you're right. You have to be afraid of that if you don't want. So it's a very good warning that for dedicated readers and someone that want to be very implicated in that. But it's the central message.
Thank you. And of course, what we're trying to do in our discussion today, but certainly in the paper as a whole, is to convey the idea that the true religion of Jesus and living the true religion of Jesus is not merely a passive matter. It is not merely listening to words. It requires activity. And now, Bob, I would like to revert to that same quotation at the end of the first paragraph on page 1 of the article and point out that there really are two parts of the activity in that quotation: seeking for a knowledge of the will of the Father in heaven, and requiring that the energies of living be consecrated to the unselfish service of the brotherhood of man. How would you associate these two elements? And do you think that the document, the essay in this section, conveys the linkages between those two factors? You're muted at the moment.
Great, thank you. Tell me which of those two again. I'm not tracking the
The first page, the first paragraph ends with a quotation, and it's a single sentence. But the final part of that sentence really has two elements: dedicate their lives to seeking for a knowledge of the will of the Father in heaven, and then requiring that the energies of living be consecrated to the unselfish service of the brotherhood of man. So the point is not merely seeking a knowledge of the will of the Father in heaven, but also serving the brotherhood of men.
right. Now, when we took this task on, we were going to take a look at this section, and you know, I looked at this section based upon what we talked about previously, and I have to say that your summaries that you that you put out were very helpful to be able to review without having to look through the entire videos again, to be honest with you, Neil. So, I applaud you for that. And it's an interesting that you asked that particular question, because we took 2 webinars on this section, 21 and 22. It goes all the way back to 2019, actually. And the interesting thing that I found in the summaries was the discussion exactly pretty much of the question that you're asking here. And there's a difference here between the group. Most of the discussion, I should say, was between the process of finding God individually and the process of God finding, I'm sorry, the process of group finding of God. And I think that it hadn't occurred to me, but this particular sentence here shows that juxtaposition. And frankly, I go back to the question that you posed earlier, what motivates an individual to do these sorts of things? And it seems to me that the individual, there is a group dynamic that occurs here. I should say that it seemed, though, that both of our webinars there was a great amount of discussion and a great amount of difference between what's more important, the group or the individual. And I think what we concluded, because of our diverse thinking about this, and looking at the past history, we went through the origin in great detail of Christianity, even in the historical part. But it occurred to me that the discussion wasn't really completely satisfied, and that this first section kind of generated a little bit of a burr under the saddle, a piece of sand in the the oyster. So I think that what we found was that there's a dynamic that's occurring here, and in the past history of Christianity, it appears as though, to me now, that that this domination of motivation has to occur both ways. It has to occur with the individual, and it has to occur with the group. Which comes first, I think, is based upon culture, is based upon the mores of the society. But there is a definite strength in the group to be able to catalyze an individual to then be motivated, because people like to meet the mores. It's even if the mores are not a law, they're very strengthening to the individual to behave in ways. So if we look back at the Hebrews, they had a real religion also, because they were active in their religion. And in fact, the midwives tell us, well, let me actually read that paragraph there. In fact, it was not the midwives. It was one second, I'll get the author here. Yes, it was the midwives, and it's in paper 185. It said, and it was at the time that Jesus was being brought in front of Pontius Pilate. And what we're told about Pontius Pilate is this: if Pontius Pilate had not been a reasonably good governor of the minor provinces, Tiberius would have hardly suffered him to remain as procurator of Judea for 10 years. Although he was a fairly good administrator, he was a moral coward. He was not a big enough man to comprehend the nature of the task as governor of the Jews. And here's the point I'm trying to make here. He failed to grasp the fact that these Hebrews had a real religion, and real is italicized in that sentence, a faith for which they were willing to die, and that millions upon millions of them scattered here and there throughout the empire looked to Jerusalem as the shrine of their faith and held the Sanhedrin in respect to the highest tribunal on earth. There's a lot going on in that section, in that paragraph. There's ideas of authority. Why would they an entire culture submit to the Sanhedrin, to those sorts of things. But yet they had a real religion. They were willing to die for it. So the interesting part about that particular sentence that you asked me to take a look at is the juxtaposition between what the real religion is of an individual and how that portrays outside of the mores, and whether or not that motivates an individual. I'll throw that back to the group. Over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate your reference to our previous discussions of this material and the controversy indeed. I believe that the question that I specifically asked was not whether the views on religious matters come from the group to the individual, but what relationship should be the individual's personal contact with God and his association with other human beings. In other words, we have a situation in which I think that the trend of the section, Finding God for Oneself, emphasizes the personal relationship with God, but then calls upon the person who does have that relationship with God to share it with others. And I would point to the final paragraph in the section, which is indeed on the second page. And that paragraph begins, as we cooperate with and seek to inspire numerous other human beings, we are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them, as well as his plans for their destiny and the destiny of our tumultuous and troubled planet, Urantia. So Marvin, you're the cleanup hitter this time, and I offer you that sentence as a stimulus, but you are certainly free to comment on anything that Bob said or the predecessors who spoke before Bob.
Thanks, Neil. That's a great sentence. And tell me again where you read that from. Is it in the first or I got a little confused.
It's on the second page of this essay, which is the concluding part of this section. And it is the final paragraph before the question A. It starts, as we cooperate with.
Got it. So it's a nice place to start. As we cooperate with, seek to inspire numerous other human beings, we are also seeking to enhance and cooperate with God's presence within them. I guess I have several thoughts in relation to this conversation, which is a great conversation. The Urantia book makes a statement that most Christians are unwitting secularists. I would dare say, I'd generalize that more broadly, that most human beings are unwitting secularists, even if they, quote, believe in God. What does it mean that someone is an unwitting secularist? Because I've thought about that quite a bit. What it means to me is that they mentally, intellectually accept the existence of God, they believe in God, but they have not engaged their lives in living relationship with God in a way that is intimate and pervasive in their lives, and that begins to affect the way they move through time, moment by moment, in communion, or if they're unwitting secularists, outside of communion with God, outside of sharing the inner life with God. And the fundamental choice is to engage in that relationship. Out of that choice flows dramatically different ways of relating to all of our sisters and brothers. And it flows out of that interior relationship. So the fundamental choice is that engagement. And they say most people are not engaged. Even if they believe, whether they believe or not, they're not engaged. They're not doing it. They accept it, but they're not doing it. And by implication, much of organized or group religious function leaves them in that place because it's not particularly effective, I think, in moving them out of the unwitting secular function into living in dynamic relationship with God. The movement, I don't think, is a group movement. I don't think, I noted when you said, Bob, was whether groups discover God or whether the individual. I don't think groups discover God. I think the discovery of God is inherently an individual function. Groups and group religious function can aid and support that endeavor, or leave it really sort of unaddressed, or sometimes because they're ineffective. They might desire to, but they're just not particularly effective at it. So the Urantia book makes a statement that between the two types of endeavor, having a relationship with God without a religion, or having a religion without a relationship with God, hands down, the relationship with God has absolute primacy. You're much better off having a living, dynamic relationship with God and having no group religious function formally than the other way around, which is where many people are, is they have formal engagement, but they don't have a living and steady engagement with God. But what the Urantia book stands, I think I'm speaking accurately, is that the best arrangement is to have the best of both, is to have fundamentally a living relationship with God that finds expression in social activity and function that encircuits that living engagement in group function and the accomplishment of group goals and ideals and communication. So definite primacy on the individual living engagement and the mobilization of the human being in that relationship. And secondarily, it's highly desirable to be involved in good group religious function for the accomplishment of many good ends, but the primacy on the individual relationship. So that's one thought. I want to talk a little bit to your motivation question, which is an intriguing question. This came up in the Cosmic Citizen conversation earlier today, and I'm fond of this cute little sort of addition to the popular aphorism. You know, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And I like the follow-up I heard one time, but you sure can't make him thirsty. So the task here in motivation is, how do you awaken people to the fact, to the reality that they are actually thirsty, that they're unsatisfied, that they yearn for something much more deep and satisfying and nurturing spiritually, and to awaken them to their thirst, to, you know, that they're suffering and going without. And that to me is the art of being fishers of men and women, as Jesus spoke. It's the art of awakening the thirst, or awakening people to the realization of their need. And when they feel their need poignantly, and you engage them well on that, then I think you can speak to what it is that will meet that need. And I think that can happen in personal ministry, and it can happen well in group religion as well, but it's a real trick to do it in group religion and move people to that real depth of engagement where they make a commitment to live day in and day out in that communion with God and in service. That's a real trick, and much of organized religion doesn't accomplish it effectively. And if we're going to engage in efforts in addition to our personal spiritual lives, we have to engage in the art form of seeing if we can do it better or well in our group religious endeavors.
Thank you, Marvin. I would simply like to follow up with you in a brief form. I think my understanding of this section is the emphasis on personal engagement and active pursuit on the part of the individual. Do you believe that that theme is adequately covered in these 2 pages that we're trying to appraise?
Yes, as setting the theme that it's the highly desirable sine qua non. Yeah, I think it's adequately addressed.
I'd also like to follow up on your reference to unwitting. This is at least the second time that I recall you calling attention to that. I think part of the point is that many people aspire to be humorous and therefore considered a wit, but some of them get only halfway there and are therefore considered a half-wit. That's not a comment on you, of course. All right, let's. Bob, you want to add? Thank you.
Yes, Neil, I would strengthen this section. If I was going to recommend this is going to be inserted inside of Revelation Revealed at some version. I assume at some point.
Yes, I was planning to drop it into that location.
Right. It was very helpful for me to go back and take a look at least the written summary that you did. And I mentioned to you that I noticed that there was this discussion that seemed to go back and forth over two webinars about group versus individual. And your question about the motivation, I think, is really a valid one. It wasn't until later that we got into the discussion of moral discernment, religious ethics, and morality unto itself. Having this section first, I think, lays a pretty good groundwork. It's a symbolic groundwork. It's a psychological groundwork, and it could be strengthened, I think, by taking some of the juice, so to speak, that was actually generated from our discussions, and putting a little bit more emphasis, I think, on the differentiation between the group and the individual and the motivation. Because I don't completely think I understand how that happens, especially when we look at the family. How does a child make the first moral decision? Well, they run through moral discernment, but the only way to do that is through family and other association, and which is why as you say, Marvin, the family is the essential and important organic organization that builds our society from bottom upwards. You look at the government on a neighboring planet. I've brought this up a number of times, and I've always been fascinated by this, that there is no priesthood. All of the religious instruction is done in the home, and that's where the idea of the torchbearers come from. Because what you do is what the parents do as the torchbearers is they light the torch for the next individual to be able to take the family up in that direction. So I think that the jury's out on that for me. And I think as a catalytic section, which is what I would, which is what I think this very first section did, could be strengthened with a little bit of what we learned from the insights of our first two webinars. Back over to you, Neil.
Thank you. I think that the question of possibly talking about the group is a bit awkward in this section because it really is directed toward the individual's personal relationship with God. On the other hand, the concluding segment of the initial quotation that I read, the initial quotation that appears at the end of the first paragraph, is the unselfish service of the brotherhood of man. So this is not service of the religious group. It is not the religious group's service to the individual, but the individual who has a personal relationship with God serving other human beings. And so there is an awkwardness here. I think your recollection of our earlier discussion is accurate. I am a little bit skeptical personally as the writer here, whether I can cover the idea that you want without detracting from the theme of the personal relationship with God, which is indeed the basis for this section. Let's go on to the next segment, which runs for several pages. It is entitled The Religion of Personal Spiritual Experience, and it is more complex intellectually. It is more complex in terms of the ideas that it contains. I think one of the elements of this section that really struck me when I was personally reviewing it to prepare for this webinar is the emphasis on mind. On the second page, we have the first paragraph of the section, and it ends almost at the end with a statement: the paradox that we cannot evade is that although spirit is not mind and most certainly transcends it, mind is nonetheless the channel for the expression of spirit in human experience. And then on the next page, there is a statement that every race of mankind has its own mental outlook on human existence. Therefore, must the religion of the mind ever run true to these various racial viewpoints. Never can the religions of authority come to unification. Human unity and mortal brotherhood can be achieved only by and through the superendowment of the religion of the spirit. Here I am reading from the quotation in the box near the bottom of page 3. So then later in the section, we go through various highlights of history having to do with the events of the 6th and 7th centuries and subsequently, whereby the Christian paradigm went forward or back, or the Muslim paradigm went forward or back because of the history. And so in the end, on page 5, I ended up with a statement near the bottom of the page, I think. Yes, religion almost invariably follows the flag, at least from very broad perspectives. And then further, we need to bear in mind that the various strands of Christianity embody cultural and social assumptions that are closely associated with the traditions, norms, and experience of persons who live in Western countries. And so I would say to you that the theme of this section is heavily influenced by the nature of mind and the vehicle of mind as a method for experiencing spirit in our lives, and that human minds differ, social minds differ, and the realm of intellectual understanding of God is influenced by the social and cultural circumstances that can be associated with the mind patterns of one's group. So with all that, perhaps a bit disconnected kind of summary, the question here is whether the idea of personal spiritual experience as mediated by the mind is clear in this section, or at least reasonably so. Now, last time I asked Andre whether he would be willing to go first, so I will not repeat that. I will ask Francois whether he is willing to be first. Do we get the connection of the mind with the spirit here and the varieties of mind that are characteristic of particular groups?
Yes, I think it's clear enough in the text, and it's very important because we often hear people say that take calm or shut up your mental, to let the spirit. It's not this way it's working. The mental is very important because it's the site of integration, and it's integrative of all the experience, spiritual and material, and it's the mental, the mind is very important, and we have to become more intelligent in the years to have a broader experience. So it's very important to put the mind in its real place, and I think the text is okay for that.
Thank you, George. Part of the theme of this section, it seems to me, has to do with the idea that the mind patterns of the Western races, the white races, basically Caucasian, have been associated with Christianity, and perhaps it's very difficult to distinguish, shall we say, the social and cultural ideals of the white races from these teachings of Jesus, because the Christianity has been understood, or at least believed to be, the repository of his teachings, whereas what the revelators have told us in various places is that the mindal patterns of a group influence the way that the spirit is portrayed. Do you have a view of this in terms of the association of personal spiritual experience with the expression in the mind, or is this too abstract to be expressed clearly?
No, this segment, you know, the extensive focus on the history, I think, brings into focus how social and cultural attitudes and beliefs affect personal spiritual experience. But you know, it's not clear cut because, you know, in the West, in the westernized, occidentalized world, maybe you can't say this anymore, but we used to have a common set of beliefs and ideas and attitudes, which made us Occidental, as opposed to the Oriental attitudes and beliefs, which were different. So, under the premise that personal spiritual experience should be identical across both sides of the planet, regardless of what the culture is, I think you can make that argument with this segment. But on the other hand, you can't have any sort of religion without belief. I mean, there has to be something to believe in. In other words, religion is not just something which occurs in the spirit alone. There is no religion for us as human beings unless there's some involvement with the mind, with ideas, with thoughts, with beliefs. And so thinking along this division between Oriental and Occidental, there have to be certain beliefs which are common to both. Otherwise, you're denying the fact that both races have the adjuster. So to me, it's far more complex than looking at the historical record of what religious groups have done. And pretty much everything you list is not particularly admirable. In fact, you end the section with a statement, how did you put it? You said it was highly problematic. Christianity is highly problematic, which really kind of leaves the impression that, with me anyway, that most of what the West, most of the attitudes and beliefs of the West need to be overcome in order to reach that place where the real religion of Jesus is. I find that difficult to process because there's no identification of what beliefs should be overcome and what beliefs should be kept. In other words, people in the Orient believe in God. They have a certain idea of God. It's not the same idea of God we have, but there has to be some commonality of belief between the two because the adjuster is at the root of all of it. So I don't know if I've made my concerns clear.
Thank you, George. I believe so. I would simply give a minor improvement to the sentence from which you quoted the ideas in the final paragraph of this section. And what it says is these social and cultural associations of Christianity are highly problematic. I did not say that Christianity itself is problematic, but the social and cultural associations. Clearly, what we're looking for is a spiritual message that will be influenced by social and cultural associations because it must be. That's one of the theories. I'm sorry, that's one of the themes of this section, but not in an exclusive way. In other words, one would think that people in other social and cultural settings should be entitled to their own social and cultural assumptions and to associate those assumptions with the true teachings of Jesus in the ways that make sense to them. Andre, have I said something that makes sense to you? Or did George say something that makes sense to you?
I'd be hard pressed to state in this that there was nothing that made sense to me, Neil. So I will state the opposite. No, it all made sense. It's a very interesting, in reviewing this once again and hearing some of the commentary from George and Francois, and I'm just minded to think again more globally. What is the real issue here? And if there's a belief to be jettisoned, as George points out, it's actually a very good question, and then to say one is hard pressed, to find a specific belief, and part of that is, I think, true until one gets to beginning to maybe look, can I say, meta beliefs, and you begin to realize there's an overarching belief that one must adhere to beliefs. One must be creedal to be religious. This is a belief that needs to be jettisoned. This, I would maintain, is a belief that most believers in the fifth epochal revelation have jettisoned. That is to say, I may have a creed, but I have it to myself. If I have certain personal beliefs, I don't wish to impose those on others, other than I would like others to realize that they too can have their own personal relationship with God. And this gets back to the nature of personal spiritual experience, having one's own personal religion, and how important this is, what this would do. And this is why you stress this at the very end of the section when you say that the Melchizedek declares in section 2 of paper 99, only the real religion of personal spiritual experience can function helpfully and creatively in the present crisis of civilization. This is essentially saying, we've seen your evolution of organized religion on this planet, and we see what it is bereft of, and you have come to a denouement, a crossroads here, where what you have no longer serves. What you have no longer has the power to transform civilization in the way that we see religion transforming civilization. And therefore, have we put out a revelation that in the first place is only going to have its effect personally on individuals. It will not likely have any kind of en masse effect yet. It will only do so by affecting individuals' personal spiritual experience. And it's interesting. I found it interesting to look at, again, what George pointed out as the history that you have there. I think it's instructive. But ultimately, we need to get back to the most salient aspect of the paper is that last question, where you put out that quote and you state, as we endeavor to embody, encourage, and advocate the religion of personal spiritual experience and simultaneously seek to stimulate active interest in the teachings of the Urantia book, how should we avoid or at least diminish the possible impression that our efforts are actually intended to promote the traditional tenets and practices of organized institutional Christianity? I can think of one member that would say, we're not supposed to not promote organized Christianity. Would it be wise for committed readers of the Urantia book to make emphatic statements disavowing these motives, not as a creed, in my opinion, though depending on who one's audience is, it makes sense to indicate that the religion of personal experience is paramount. So the advantages and disadvantages are that one, I'll speak from my own personal standpoint, in taking the position that I disavow creeds to be held by groups. I do not wish to establish a creed for myself or another group of disavowing creeds.
Well, that's quite interesting. I think you have given us a useful contrast to the adjective that Marvin likes, unwitting. I would say that's a wittingly explicit disavowal. All right, Marvin, you asked to speak next, but I am going to extract a favor from you. You can speak next, but I ask you not to come in at the very end after someone else, because now it's your turn. Okay, go ahead, Marvin.
I'll do my best to accommodate that, Neil. I'd like to contribute to the current conversation by sharing an experience. I don't think any of the rest of you, but Andre, have you been to the parliaments?
I was there in 2018 in Toronto. Yeah,
Yeah.
the only one.
So you've experienced. I've been to 5 of them now. The first one was in Cape Town, South Africa, then Melbourne, Australia, then Barcelona, then Salt Lake City, and then Toronto. These are remarkable events. You got to picture this. This is an event where over a period of 6 or 7 days, really 6 full days, anywhere from 7 to 10,000 people gather at a convention, full time, full of programming, full of sharing and interaction. That's a lot of people over an 8, 9 day, 7 day, 6, 7 day period. They come from every part of the world. The first time in South Africa, when I saw the stadium that was full of these people and I walked around, I was absolutely floored. Every imaginable race and some I could not imagine. I mean, there were people that looked like no one I had ever seen before, coming from the far corners of the earth, in every imaginable traditional garb, with ritualistic elements, and many of them not. Many of them adherents of religions, many of them just spiritual seekers. And at the end of that period, everyone was, and all the way through, but increasingly in a crescendo, people were loving each other, relating to each other in the most beautiful ways, really as a living embodiment and expression of the family of God that transcended all institutions, religious institutions included. And I want to go back and look at the paragraphs that you shared with us, Neil, because as I look them over with that experience in mind, and these were transformative experiences, I'd have to say that those 2 paragraphs that we read were a description of, almost to a T, of what I was experiencing during that period of time. And it was a stunning and life transforming experience for me. That's why I go to these things every time. It's a stunning and life transforming experience. And we have had a Urantia book booth at each of these, really from that Cape Town experience on. And this last time in Toronto, there were close to 100 Urantia book readers from all around the country, and some other parts as well, who experienced this immersion. And I think it was transformative for everybody there. So I want to read these 2 paragraphs with that in mind, and make a couple of comments. Every race of mankind has its own mental outlook upon human existence. Therefore must the religion of the mind ever run true to these various racial viewpoints. I'm just going to skip around. Human unity and mortal brotherhood can only be achieved through this super endowment of the religion of the experience. On all mankind indwelt by the same divine and eternal experience. And only as these divergent mind religions of authority become impregnated with and overshadowed by the unifying, ennobling religion of the spirit, the religion of personal spiritual experience, can these problems be cleared up. Anyways, I won't read the rest of it. What I'll simply say is there were two themes that ran throughout these conferences. One was social activity to change the world. But the other, and it's growing, is the influence of what I call contemplative practice. The large majority of these people are in the advanced ranks of their religious traditions, and they almost always engage in some form of living personal spiritual interaction with deity and in contemplative practice. And as a result, what we experience there, everyone has their diverse doctrines and dogmas. No one pays a whole lot of attention to them. They're brought in, they're shared, and they're part of the backdrop. But what animates all of the interactions and engagements is the atmosphere of common spiritual unity that's underlying through encounter with the divine. And for me, it's a taste of light and life. It's a window into what they're trying to describe in these two paragraphs. And I think it is not a coincidence that these parliaments have resumed in the last 25 years as our existential threats to our global situation have mounted. And I think this is major forward moving work on the part of the angels. The global interfaith movement is the emergence of what they're describing in these two paragraphs. And the Urantia book and its presence has a very healthy and respected role to play in that emerging movement as it's developed through the far-seeing efforts of a number of Urantia book readers, Peter Lawrence, Garth Jameson, Bettina Gray, a number of them who early on have really been involved in United Religions Initiative, Parliament of the World's Religions, the Compassion Project, which are the three global, really powerful global organizations driving this vast cultural change. And so my sense is what's described in these paragraphs is happening, and we are part of it. And it's unfortunate that most Urantia book readers have a very small exposure to it because it's thrilling. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Andre, if you had any parallel experiences along these lines there.
I don't know if Andre wants to come in, but I would say that I have to recognize Bob because he hasn't yet had a chance. And I would explain to Bob that my inclination was to call on you before I called on Marvin, but Marvin sent me a chat message requesting that he be next, and I yielded to that. So you, Bob, are last in this sequence because Marvin intervened. In any case, I would like to ask you essentially to consider whether part of the difficulty we have is the mindal and social associations whereby Christians have the common view that Jesus belongs to them, in the sense that Christianity embodies certain social and cultural traits, whereas we know that Jesus, as the incarnated bestowal of Michael of Nebadon, belongs to the whole world. And it is not up to one group or one segment of the world to act in a possessive sense toward his teachings, toward his life. Now, I don't know if you want to take that on, but you could. Otherwise, you could react to anything that Marvin said or that another predecessor has said.
Yes, I could react to that. But I do want to react to Marvin, and I am interested in hearing from Andre on his experience at the Parliaments of Religion. Marvin, Neil, I'm going to hold off that thought that you had there because I'm not sure there was a question, but we did talk in many of our webinars. There were, let me get this right, there were 6 webinars that covered this particular topic. But there was one phrase that came out, Marvin. I just looked up the paragraph, and it's in the second discourse where it's all Jesus speaking. this is where I believe the Midwayers, even though that they're translating into the current vernacular, I think is about as accurate as we're going to get as to what Jesus said in the second discourse. And let me read paragraph 155, section 6, paragraph 9, where we start to talk about the religions, where he starts to talk about the religions of authority. And he says that the religions of authority can only divide men and set them in conscientious array against each other. The religion of the Spirit will progressively draw men together and cause them to become understandingly sympathetic with one another. Kind of where I thought I got the theme out of what you were talking about there. The religions of authority require of men uniformity in belief, but this is impossible of realization in the present state of the word. Of the world. The religion of the Spirit requires only unity of experience, uniformity of destiny, making full allowance for diversity of belief. The religion of the Spirit requires only, and I'm going to just slow this down here, uniformity of insight. I want to read that again. The religion of the Spirit requires only uniformity of insight, not uniformity of viewpoint and outlook. The religion of the Spirit does not demand uniformity of intellectual views, only unity of spirit feeling. The religions of authority crystallize into lifeless creeds. The religion of the Spirit grows into the increasing joy and liberty of ennobling deeds, loving service, and merciful ministration. Marvin, you said something that was interesting, in that this 6,000 or 7,000 individuals, it is a lot. And oh, by the way, I am impressed by your travel itinerary. My goodness, you've gone to some great lengths to get to these parliaments. What a wonderful experience. Here for you, and good on you, so to speak. What I sensed from what you said, and maybe Andre could follow this up a little bit, is that what I think you're seeing there is a uniformity of insight, making full allowance for the diversity of belief. This may be something that the Master Seraphim are turning up the dial a little bit, potentially. And it'd be interesting for us to take a look and see what potential groups this would be. But in this, and we talked in the last 4 or 5 or 6 webinars about the difference between the religion of authority and the religion of the Spirit. And it seems to me that just as Jesus told the apostles, get ready, boys, we're going to cause some problems when we bring this new religion into the religion of authority. Even though the Hebrews had a real religion, Jesus's real religion is the religion of the Spirit. And it seemed to me, and I could have read more into what you were saying there, that this group of individuals from all parts of the planet are trying and attempting to move into the religion of the Spirit, a uniformity of insight, which is almost a paradox. Unity, not uniformity. But here we want uniformity of insight at the Spirit level. Very interesting statement that Jesus made to these apostles that we read in that second discourse. So Neil, to get back to we started out kind of talking about the Occidental.
But before you go on, I'd simply like to point out for the viewers that much of your previous remarks consisted of reading the paragraph near the bottom of page 3 of the essay, which is fine.
Perfect.
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah.
All right. Now go ahead with your additional comment, please.
Yeah. Take me back again and tell me what that topic was. I got a little bit interested in that compartmentalized thought there.
Well,
you were asking.
The basic idea had to do with possessiveness in a social and cultural sense, and that.
Oh, absolutely.
That Christians, taking their own view, effectively have laid hands on Jesus as if Jesus belongs to them, belongs to Christianity only.
Absolutely. Matter of fact, that was a note that I made here, that that was one of the issues in the Occidental side that kind of came out of the chosen people syndrome. And while Christianity is flowed in with all of the pagan streams of belief, etc., it still seems to hold on to that particular, although some parts of it are now moving into this other spirit of religion of the spirit rather than of the authority, because it's the authority that has to demand that we've got the right idea here. So we need to pursue this idea. Occidentalization does have some issues, and that certainly is one that came over from the idea of the chosen people. I did want to make one other quick comment before I go back and hopefully hear from Andre here. There was once in webinar 24, I would point everybody to go back and read about the weirdos. You passed out an article, which was a contemporary article. I've got it here. I'm going to bring it up. I'm going to read a paragraph that was in there. Hopefully I'll find it. Oh yeah, here it is. It was an article by Megan McArdle. I think it's in the Washington Post. And Occidentalization is definitely driven to the individual. In my study of management theory over the years, that has been one of the predominantly difficult things to try to figure out as to how management structures and theories and flows ought to work. And I had mentioned in some previous sessions that the quality movement that started from Japan right after the Second World War that Dr. Deming brought over fit into the Eastern mind, which is more of a group mind than it is an individual mind. Occidentalization is predominantly an individual mind. It's always been an interesting facet, and I think it has a lot to do with this chosen people syndrome in some really interesting ways. But this idea of weirdos stands for, let me get it right here. Give me 1 second here.
Western educated, industrialized, rich, and I've lost the D, right?
Yeah, I had it in a second. I'm not finding it, but yes, that's exactly what it means. And in fact, this is the only paragraph I wanted to read because it kind of maps into this whole Occidental idea that I've been struggling with for 30 years or so. Weirdos are more individualistic and independent, less conformist and obedient, more likely to favor impersonal prosociality. The idea that one set of moral rules should govern how you treat everyone, from the most distant stranger to your neighbor to your nearest kin. This seems normal to them, but in a global context, weird people really are extremely weird. And as modernity erodes, the last vestige of traditionalism, they're probably getting weirder and weirder by the day. It's a really good article about I think if we look at it as the Occidental culture, it's a pretty good one, and it's mostly a secular article than it really is a religious article.
But I think you've already agreed that we do not have a lock hold on Jesus, that Jesus is there for the entire world.
For sure. Yeah.
And that other groups of people are fully entitled to interpret him and his teachings from their cultural perspectives, not only from ours. So you would agree with that?
Absolutely.
I see you nodding. Well, Andre, I'm calling on you not only because of my own personal enthusiasm, but because I have two requests from your colleagues, both from Marvin and from Bob, to put you on the plate. And so here you are. Well,
I'll try to be brief. First of all, to Marvin's original point, I did have a remarkably moving experience at the Parliament of the World Religions. And to be succinct about it, I guess part of what I would say was that I came away that with not just the sense, but almost with the inner motivation that were I to having spoken against creedal religion, were I to have a creedal religion based on that experience, my creedal religion would be that I believe in interfaith. You know, I believe in other words, in the dialogue, the confraternity, and the communion of individual religious believers of all faiths in their striving to understand each other. And isn't that also part of what we have been advised in terms of our ability to love each other really is born of a thoroughgoing understanding of each other. We could find that quote easily enough where it says, you cannot love another by a mere act of the will. You must come to understand your fellows. And as you understand your fellows, you will grow to love each of them. Well, to the extent that that could be put in terms of a tenet of a new faith, that would have to be one of the outworkings of the Parliament of the World Religion in terms of my own personal faith, that I do believe in interfaith. I believe in that dialogue and that confraternity of individual religionists who are striving to get to know each other and get to know the ins and outs of each other's faiths.
First, let me thank you for that. I think we have a word here that probably needs to be explored slightly. The traditional use of believe has to do with doctrines or creeds, whereas you're using believe in the sense of I am open to, I accept, I support. And I fully agree with you that those are valid uses, but they are not theories, they are not doctrines, they are rather a statement of acceptability, of value. And I think you're nodding to accept that interpretation.
Exactly, and I think it's very important to indicate that to the extent that a belief becomes doctrinaire, to that extent it becomes ineffective. If that belief does not become faith, in other words, a belief I'm willing to act on, what is its motive force? What is its power in my life? What, in the Rodanian sense, is its ability to modify and upstep my art of living? It is powerless unless it does have that lack of being something that is simply a doctrine, something to adhere to, that is not acted on.
Thank you. I think we've had a very good discussion of this section. I'm ready now to move on to the next section, which is called The Presence of God, and it runs from page 7 through page 11. I would say to you that if we look at this as an editorial review, it's probably important for me to point out a statement by Jesus that is at the near the end of this section, and it is in the box on page 10. And I will simply read the first sentence of that statement. He states, "It is not so important that you should know about the fact of God as that you should increasingly grow in the ability to feel the presence of God." So that, frankly, as a statement, was the motivating force that caused me to begin writing this section. If we're going to feel the presence of God, we have to understand the idea of God's presence in a broader way than the tradition. So now we go back to the beginning of this segment called The Presence of God, and it goes through intellectually a whole variety of ideas of God's presence that frankly are not conventional. I start with the idea of God's immanence on page 7. And then toward the bottom of that same page, I excerpt ideas from the foreword, whereby the divine counselor gives 7 meanings of the word God. God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, God the Supreme, God the Sevenfold, God the Ultimate, God the Absolute. After which there is commentary about the Supreme Being, and then extensive discussion of the various names for Michael of Nebadon, our Creator's son, linked indeed with further material about God the Supreme. And so the question of presence here is deliberately multiple. There are many ways that God is present. And the point is, as Jesus said, it is not so important that you should know about the fact of God as that you should increasingly grow in the ability to feel the presence of God. So my question to you, gentlemen, is whether effectively this comes out and that the idea that the presence of God is multiple and diverse, and that we should be able to feel that presence is adequately portrayed in the text. George, would you take a chance at that one?
Yeah, I found this section confusing. You know, in terms of the title of the paper, The Real Religion of Jesus, the presence of God always refers to the adjuster. So that as the immanent. And then all of the other presences you cite are a matter of the Urantia doctrine. They're not experienceable. So, hey, so I found it confusing. I mean, I totally agree with that sentence you identified, that we need to increasingly grow in the ability to feel the presence of God. But I mean, maybe I understand it differently from everybody else, but to me, that always has meant the adjuster. So including all of these other focal points in Urantia doctrine about where the presence of God is and isn't, and so on and so forth, to me, just clouds the issue.
Thank you. You certainly are entitled to that, and your comments are part of our tradition of pluralism and diversity. Francois, what do you say about this? Do you feel that the exploration of the presence of God and its many different aspects is valid and useful to you?
Yes, and it's what we talk for the last in the last minutes. We have to know that we experience first and we interpret second. But the real experience of God, that's right, that's the adjuster, but your own adjuster, but you can see God with other adjusters. And so I come back to what you told about the Parliament of Religions, and it was the presence of God that you experienced. Okay? When thousands of people make an effort to gather in a place, they give God an opportunity to act. And you all together lived the real presence of God, and it was a genuine experience. That's why you have no words, and so no, it's me because I have got baptism, but not you. Know it's something very over there. So yes, it all started with the thought adjuster, but I think you all gave God the opportunity to give you an experience together, because when you experience God and as an individual and you're alone, it turns you but after, what are we doing, humans? We interpret, and now the interpret is it's very intellectual, the interpretation, but the real experience was first and the interpretation was second. So it's why the presence of God is important. When you have a real experience after, well, what is the interpretation of you and you? It's not important. You will try to interpret, but the experience was real.
Well, let me ask you basically, Francois, whether you share George's apparent view that the presence of God is predominantly the presence of the thought adjuster, or do you see these other explanations in the essay as being valuable too?
The thought adjuster is the fundamental unity, but it's not just that. See, we have a sevenfold God that's described there in your essay, and they're all real. But no, it's not just the thought adjuster, but the thought adjuster is the fundamental unity. Like the ultimatum is the fundamental unity of the matter.
Thank you, Marvin. I'm going to go back to your inquiry or comments about wittingly and unwittingly. Would you say wittingly that in these few pages we have wittingly expressed the witting presence of God? God is not unwittingly present, he is wittingly present. And is that clear enough?
I gotta say, I'm witless at this point. Your question has left me witless here, Neil. I'm going to skirt your question.
Without being totally foolish in this, what I'm trying to say is that this presence of God that we're describing is indeed intentional and multiple. It is not unwitting. So if you want to comment on that, then feel free.
I think
you'll go in other directions. That's fine.
Yeah, I think I'll leave that as your contribution and
Okay.
go in a different direction. And it's the direction of sort of really the initial questions you asked, which I think both George and Francois addressed, and I'm in agreement with George, and I think I'm in agreement with Francois as well. And I want to elaborate just a little bit and speak a little further about my experience at the Parliament. God is ultimate, God is absolute, God is supreme, God is 7 levels of manifestation in the age of the supreme, triodities, triunities, quartan levels of ages of light and life. To me, those are all the theology of the Urantia book, and frankly, the doctrine of the Urantia book. It's the language we speak, and if you ask me if I feel it's relevant, sure, it's relevant. That's because I'm a Urantia book reader. It's the frame of reference I've chosen to adopt, and it's my working frame of reference for reality. But it's a profoundly Urantia bound frame of reference. And every other person who's not a dyed-in-the-wool Urantia book reader would see it essentially as Urantian doctrine. Much the same as Hindu doctrine would have a pantheon of deities characterized by different qualities. And that is the language that Hindus use to get in touch with and enumerate the experience they have with God. And as such, my experience at the Parliament says to me that to the extent I hold those front and center, they are separators between us and the goal that's being described on that second page of yours, of the overarching reality. The overarching reality is that which flows from the experience of relationship with God, with the divine, however we understand it or describe it. And that's what was so joyous about the Parliament experience. And I consider it a window into the ages of light and life, where I think the reality of the interfaith family of all believers, even those who don't have a specific belief, but have the living encounter with God and attempt to share it with others who have differing frames of reference and differing languages. It's an understanding that the doctrinal languages, even the conceptual languages that characterize our particular traditions, are profoundly secondary. What's primary is what you pointed to at the beginning of this section of the discussion, Neil. What's primary is the felt experience of encounter and relationship with the divine. And there are endless ways to describe it and communicate about it. And that's what's such a joy about the Parliament, is you start to experience that living reality of profound appreciation for the different languages and different doctrines, with no investment in trying to figure out which is right or better. None. There's no interest in anyone's trying to convince each other. Everyone accepts the utility of the language and doctrine that whoever you're speaking with uses. And we're trading and sharing, but by and large, we're speaking much more about the elemental experience of encounter. And that's where the richness and the energy and the joy comes from, in the spiritual sharing of sisters and brothers, in the commonality of the experience, despite the endless variety of language and frame of reference. And that's a living reality. I wouldn't say it's attempting to be done at the Parliament. I'm saying it's being done beautifully already. And it's growing. It has a real dynamism to it. And I think the Urantia book fits as a movement, as a culture, very nicely within that larger cultural parameter.
Thank you. Bob, I'm going to turn to you next. And some of our colleagues, some of your colleagues, some of my colleagues have commented that a fair amount of the vocabulary in this segment of my essay is Urantia book specific vocabulary, and I think that's true. On the other hand, if we go back to the first paragraph of this segment, it talks about God's immanence. And the idea of the immanence of God is certainly not unique to the Urantia book. We have the theological phrase that has long been present in Christianity, God immanent and God transcendent. And both of those elements exist. They have been emphasized at much different levels of intensity. But anyway, what I'm finally going to ask you is whether God's presence, as described in this section, is adequately explained, and whether you believe that the segment of the paper serves its purpose for that reason.
I'm not sure that I can answer that question. I would have to spend a little bit more time rereading the section and looking at it. But I think that the language that you use needs to be out of the Revelation, and I certainly endorse that. What I was going to say, so I kind of, I'm sort of punting on that one a little bit. I can't really put a value judgment on that section. But the topic heading is pretty important, because the Melchizedek in paper 103, section 4 on spiritual communion says to put some interesting statements out here. Of course, this is in part 3 before you even get to where Jesus's words are talking about the presence of God. The Melchizedek talks about the practice of the presence of God, which is the prelude to true worship. And that eventuates, of course, in the brotherhood of man. There's a lot going on with the process here. So what is the presence of God? Absolutely agree with George that the discerning spirit, which is how Christianity, that even the Egyptians and all societies at one point understood, my internet connection is unstable. I lost you early on. I got back into it. I don't know if you even knew that I was gone.
We lost you for perhaps 5 seconds or so here, maybe a little more. But go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, earlier I was off completely. I had to log back in. I don't think anybody even knew that.
Okay, I was just commenting right now while you were speaking that your voice was inaudible for at least 5 seconds. But anyway.
Yeah, I thought so, because I got the message. So the presence of God is a practice that obviously Lucifer didn't do. Frankly, because he didn't have an adjuster, I think is probably part and parcel of all this. But the concept of the supreme, which is essentially God immanent, in my mind, leads us into this whole idea of uniformity of insight that I brought on earlier. Is that how do you practice the presence of God? Well, talk to your thought adjuster. That's certainly one thing on a daily basis. I remember Bill Sadler Jr. in many of his society lectures. When folks asked him that question, he said, talk to him like you talk to, a friend or a neighbor. He said, you need to get to know your adjuster. So this is a practice that leads to true worship. Well, what is true worship? Well, it's an experience. True worship becomes an experience realized on 4 cosmic levels: the intellectual, the moral, the spiritual, the personal, the consciousness of mind, soul, and spirit, and the unification of personality. It's the entire cosmic picture. So I think that the topic is certainly a topic that points to the real religion of Jesus. And the living part of it, to me, needs to be this practice part, of which I think that the jury is out on that one, that we need to really think about that and say, well, how do I do these sorts of things? And are other cultures in this whole parliament of religion, are they doing anything in their cultures that are even addressing that? I'm sure they are. And I would like to hear and see what, if that in fact is actually happening. That's an important part of what the Melchizedek tells us, and it leads us to true worship and the brotherhood of man. Back over to you.
Thank you. In turning to Andre, I would make the obvious point, perhaps to unify some of the discussion, that the goal I had in writing this section was to emphasize that God is present, that he is present in many different ways on many different levels. And if we can relate to that and sense it, then we are fulfilling the goals that Jesus stated in that segment of the excerpt at the very end of the section. So it's your turn, Andre. Please feel free to comment in whatever way that seems appropriate to you.
I'd almost prefer some direction, but there are a couple of things that were occurring to me. One is that speaking about the nature of the document. It's always important to realize who is the intended audience for the document, and to the extent that the document's audience is largely going to be those who are already reader believers and adherents to the teachings of the Urantia book. To that extent, you might disallow George's point about the distraction of the doctrinal aspects of dealing with those 7 appellations of deity. But to the extent that you're speaking to a larger audience, and an audience that is going to be trying to learn, for instance, about the presence of God from this document, to that extent, I'd have to be in agreement with George about his point about that. Having said that, I think it proceeds very well for someone like our present audience and to people that take the teachings of the Urantia book seriously. So the only thing really to shoot back to you, Neil, regarding that aspect of it, and it's a narrow aspect as far as I'm concerned, would be who is your audience for this particular paper, and how do you hope that it's received ultimately? What kind of an audience do you hope for? Speaking then about what really strikes me about maybe the where this particular article and this section of the article goes on the presence of God. I'm interested in this last part of your blue box quote where it talks about when you once begin to find God in your soul, etc. But what chance does the Father have to appear as a God of supreme loyalties that give, little or no time to thoughtful contemplation of such eternal realities? While the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, it is indeed the gateway thereto. Well, that would seem to validate, our consideration of such concepts on the other hand. And so to the extent that we can invite people into, I mean, what are we interested in as students of the Urantia book and as vehicles for conveying its teachings? We certainly understand that this revelation is not meant to be taken in pieces. It's meant to be taken as a whole, but at the same time, it's not a verse for people to take what they like and leave the rest. And I would state that in the context of, would we object on this world were people to take the main salient message of the Urantia book, the gospel of the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man, or stated maybe more modernly, the creative parenthood of deity and the fellowship of all men and women on earth. None of us would object to that. None of us would object to that incremental move. On the other hand, they give us all of this because they know that it's necessary. They give us God the absolute, for goodness sake, to take it to an absurd extreme. They give us the consummator of universe destiny in one part. Now, what of any of us will be able to say anything about the consummator of universe destiny? I don't know, but I can tell you honestly that in the last month, I said my first prayer to the consummator of universe destiny, if just as an exercise, if nothing else. And why? They're telling us about these wonderful realities for some reason. They want to expand our vision of what the universe is. And we are at this nascent ground floor understanding that is going to grow generation by generation with students of the Urantia book until some of the understandings of what's here are going to appear foreign to us, except that we'll have had the benefit of learning on the Urantia spheres by then. It's going to be very, very interesting to see what develops ultimately out of this revelation. So if I'm appearing to ramble a bit, let me get back to the idea that the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, but it is indeed the gateway there too. I think it's a knife edge for us to balance on that and to always consider, to whom are we speaking? And when we're speaking to each other, we ought to consider that we ought to challenge each other to some extent, but even then regard, what is my fellow really willing to hear? On the other hand, when speaking to a wider audience, we ought to keep it as simple as possible.
Thank you. I think at this point, it would be helpful for me to explain what this document is. This document is an insertion for Revelation Revealed. My concept, which I have discussed at various times with Bob, is that after we finish topic 8 as a whole, it will then be appropriate to do a revised edition of Revelation Revealed by including this material and something that I haven't mentioned in quite a while, the material of a few pages about the Emperor Constantine and the religion of Christianity becoming the state religion of the Roman Empire. And so I intend to put this material in a location in a revised version of topic 8, and likewise the material about Constantine in another location, all in a revised edition that it seems to me will be appropriate only after we finish to the end of topic 8, which is still a ways ahead of us. But that does indeed answer your question. The intention is that this material is for committed readers of the Urantia book, as is indeed the case of Revelation Revealed as a whole. So I think the point of the explanation has to do with expanding the awareness of readers of the Urantia book about God's presence in the terms that the revelators use in the Urantia book. And that was my intention. Gentlemen, let's go on to the next section, which is the longest of the paper, the mission and the timeline running from page 11 to page 18, the end of the article as a whole. It starts off with 3 paragraphs that are taken from a manual's instructions to Michael shortly before Michael, left Salvington in order to bestow himself on Urantia in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth. And these 3 paragraphs are interesting in themselves. We had a fair amount of discussion of them as we went through it previously. The paragraph at the bottom of page 11 talks about avoiding social entanglements. Confine your efforts largely to spiritual regeneration and intellectual emancipation. The next paragraph at the top of page 12 calls on him to have an improved and enduring system of positive religious ethics. And then in the third of these 3 paragraphs, actually numbered 5, in the box at the top of page 12, avoiding the establishment of an organized cult, crystallized religion, or segregated ethical grouping. Well, these instructions, it seems to me from my recollection of our discussion, were honored by Jesus. But we have a mixed set of results in terms of his followers who picked out their own views of his message and then did it with it as they wished. So we discussed what happened in the history of humanity. In the history of Christianity following the life of Jesus, how some of the ideas that Emmanuel had put forward to Michael were not honored and were, in fact, breached very dramatically. And then we talked about, the fact that this was Michael's 7th and final bestowal, that he achieved his universe sovereignty in the context of this bestowal. And then there was extended discussion of the timeline, whereby in a couple of excerpts, he warned the apostles, he warned his followers that there would be a long period in which substantial numbers of human beings prefer the religion of authority rather than direct personal experience as he advocated. So in effect, the section, the mission and the timeline, has basically 2 concepts. First, that Michael was given very specific instructions that he observed, but that his followers did not observe. And then that the timeline for true acceptance of his teachings in terms of active personal involvement with God by each person is a very long timeline, but that eventually his teachings will prevail. On page 17, the midwayers assure us there is in the teachings of Jesus an eternal nature which will not permit them forever to remain unfruitful in the hearts of thinking men. So my question to you, gentlemen, is whether this segment expresses the ambiguity of instructions that Michael, in the human form of Jesus, did follow, but which were not honored by his many successors. That's part of it. And then the amount of time that it will take for his true message to be expressed in the hearts of men in the way that he intended. So Francois, are you convinced, are you in the belief that basically we have conveyed the ambiguities of this material in ways that are at least reasonably clear?
In a way, yes, everything is expressed in that, but on the other hand, I don't know if every reader will find this or not. Just say the succeeders have failed in their mission, but it's not me. When I read again before this webinar, what I saw in that section is the expression that Jesus sowed the good seeds. It was all right. He did what he could do, but the soil is not ideal actually. So it may take a lot of time, but when the conditions will be reunited, I agree when they say at page, it's page 13 or what the
passage that I quoted was on page 17.
17.
Yes, that's the first sentence in the quotation on the box at the bottom, that mistake not, there is in the teachings of Jesus an eternal nature.
That's what I'm talking about. So it's a statement. It's not just a vote, but it will happen. But when? But I think that yes, when we read this section, the tension between what Michael wanted and how it is now, we can see that in the text.
Thank you. I would explain that if I stated that his successors failed, I didn't mean to. They departed from the sense of the instructions that Emmanuel gave. And some of what they did was successful and helpful. Parts of it were not as successful and not as helpful. And indeed, the timeline, I think, is the key feature of this section. Bob, what would you say? Are we basically dealing in ambiguities here and in effect an incomplete event that still will take a considerable amount of time to be brought to fruition?
I'm not sure they're ambiguities, Neil. I think they're paradoxes. I think that there were more paradoxes that came to me during the series of webinars. And oh, by the way, this last section took 10 webinars. The mission and timeline. I think that for what we did about the mission itself, going over paper 120 in great depth with at least 3 or 4 webinars, was really good to do, to be able to understand what the mission was. What was Michael as Jesus really trying to accomplish. And much of our discussion did tease out quite a lot of interesting paradoxes. How did they come to the Trinity concept, for example? We know that Jesus taught the apostles the truth regarding the paradise Trinity. That's really interesting. And then when Thomas and Nathaniel talked to Rodin, they actually got him to understand the Father, that God has a personality. Apparently, Rodin was fighting them, and it took them, a couple of days to try and figure it out. And they brought in Jesus, and he wouldn't have anything to do with it because he wanted them to work it out. I forget whether it was Thomas that came back and said, look, we've got this doctrine. He called it at the time. In fact, the Midwayers tell us that the doctrine of the Trinity was how they were able to get Rodin to understand that God has a personality, and then of course then we get this revelation, and we get this entire aspect of personality as being, as George writes, and I agree, super existential. I mean, this is something that is that without the understanding of personality, I don't think that the revelation could have told us all that they tell us about the consummator of a universe destiny, for example, or God the Supreme, the Supreme Being, which will be a personality when all personalities finally go to light and life. So we're talking about a very interesting paper that paper 120, which starts part 4, to thoroughly go through that. And I think that if we go back and look at the summaries, or someone decides to take a look at some of those, I think you can almost look at a webinar as severable, because there's so many interesting concepts. And I want to go back to something that Andre made me think about, because when I first started to take a look at this, at the document as a whole, I was trying to think, okay, are these puzzle pieces that we're putting together, and does it really matter? Are they severable unto themselves? And I think that this particular section can be severable unto itself. I don't think it necessarily has to have a Maslow baseline, for example, needs, wants, cares, and self-actualization. There's probably some kind of a nice pyramid we can draw of all these parts and put them together. But I think for what we've done with with the webinars, that each one is severable unto itself. And this particular section, to start off with the mission, is pretty critical. I'd almost put that one first, but it is a little bit more complex. And I think that putting it last, at least in this, is certainly not a problem. But I would consider maybe moving it into a different phase of of the document. Not necessarily strong about that, but certainly take a look at it. I'm not exactly sure I completely agree with putting it first, but it is a key topic for us to understand, and sets the stage for everything that comes later in part 4 of the papers. Back over to you.
Thank you. I would simply comment from the perspective of an author, either an author of an essay, an author of a story, that the two most emphatic parts of any document are, 1, the beginning, and 2, the ending. That the items in the middle tend to get less attention, and frankly are usually devoted to matters that are of less importance. In response to you as the author, commenting on my editorial capabilities or style, shall we say, I think this material at the end has the merit of leaving the outcome a matter of conjecture and discussion for the timeline involved and how the subject will be worked out eventually. Because in effect, we are dealing with, shall we say, a mark of incomplete. If someone had to give a mark to the overall experience of Michael's bestowal in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth, it right now would be marked as incomplete. He can't get an A because it hasn't been fully achieved. But it's the incompleteness, to me, that makes this logical as the concluding segment of the essay, which indeed is going to be folded back into a somewhat expanded version of Revelation Revealed. George, I don't know if you would like to take a crack at the question of sequence, or whether you believe that basically what this section achieves or tries to achieve is to portray a situation of incompleteness, and it may or may not do that adequately.
Oh, I think it does. I think it conveys that sense. All of our discussions about timelines have certainly brought up a lot of different ideas about what that might be and how it might come to pass. But no, I think this segment conveys that idea very well.
Thank you. I am hesitating now between Andre and Marvin as to wondering which of them is the most complete. Maybe we'll start with Marvin on the assumption that whatever Marvin leaves incomplete, Andre will solve for us.
Maybe we should speak together.
Oh, in stereo, please.
You would have to have a script. I'm sorry.
I don't
That's
know. We're
Another
pretty,
comment as an editor.
we're pretty good at improvising and leapfrogging. The answer to your first question is no. If I
Which was
understand
my
your
first question. I'm sorry.
has Christianity adequately fulfilled the spirit of Jesus' mission and how it was configured?
Okay.
If I understand, that was my understanding of your question. And the question is, how long will it take for that mission to actually be accomplished in its original outlay? My sense is that's a very important question because it's more than an academic question. It's a question that has profound imports that flow forward from this point on. And to me, there's the major variable that will determine whether it's accomplished at all and the how soon it might be accomplished has everything to do with what this current generation and upcoming generations of readers of the Urantia book do with the mission of the revelation as it's laid out, and particularly the mission that's described as the promotion of the restatement of the religion of Jesus to the world as a whole. And if we address that task seriously and vigorously, I think that the timeline that they lay out is that we would largely, we could make substantial progress in accomplishing Jesus' original mission by 1,000 years down the line. And if we dilly-dally around and don't really address it as our evolutionary part of our evolutionary mandate with this revelation, then it may not be accomplished until further revelations. It could take a very long time. So there, Andre, yours to leapfrog.
It's now Andre's turn to complete your ideas to the degree that he is motivated to do that.
I'm left speechless.
Uh-oh.
You know what? I guess what occurs to me, there's a couple of things that occur to me. Number one, just the value in the dialogue on this topic and how this really needs to be put forward out there. And while I may not need to have permission, I would like I'm inspired to carry this dialogue into one of the Urantia University cafes pretty soon, maybe this Friday, I don't know. But what strikes me here is just how much, I mean, just pulling back from this a moment and thinking about the revelation from the standpoint of what if we didn't have a revelation right now? And what is the implication of there being a revelation of the gospel of Jesus, the brotherhood of man, the fatherhood of God, and trying to make that into a living religion? Were we to take a null hypothesis right now of there being no Urantia revelation, from the standpoint, we would have to take as a conclusion or as an implication of this being here, that without it, there is some thought on the part of the revelators that Christianity and religion on this planet in general is in danger of failing in terms of inculcating personal spiritual experience en masse to the extent that it will keep civilization going. Now, I don't know if you would agree with that conclusion or not, but that's quite an implication. We have a revelation here because they presume that this is A, necessary, and B, that it will work. That's the other implication. You know, did the religion of Jesus fail? Did the fourth epical revelation to this planet fail? No. It's still in progress. Did Melchizedek's revelation fail? No. It provided the groundwork for Jesus of Nazareth. So I don't think that the fifth epical revelation would have been put here were this simply a chance or let's give it a crack. I think this is going to succeed. The question is how. And the outworking of that plan is nothing that's necessarily obvious, but it's something that how this is outworked is going to be quite interesting and unique. And it's maybe not occurred to us completely as to how this will bring about a full resurgence of the religion of personal experience, not just in Christianity, but in all religions. And that's what I'm left with as an intriguing kind of question, implication, and foundation for creative provocation.
Well, that was a very provoking remark. But I assume you meant it to be creative, and I would just confide to you that I was intending to be humorous. It was a useful provocation. We are now effectively in the concluding minutes. I have commented, I'm sorry, I have listened to various comments by many of you to the effect that during previous webinars, we discussed various points and that they were useful. So just as a logical matter, this leads me to believe that this document is a useful reinforcement to Revelation Revealed topic 8, and that discussing it has given perhaps a broader understanding of the real religion of Jesus than was available from that document as it stood originally. I offer the opportunity for anyone who wishes to comment on the general value of this document as a whole and the degree to which it succeeds or failed to convey valuable insight into the true teachings of Jesus. May I recognize you on that question, Marvin?
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement with Andre's recent comments. I think it is valuable, and I think all of our conversations have been valuable, and as the documents are springboards for the conversations, I think they are very helpful. I actually think, I think the end result that is really sort of the fruits of your labors, Neil, are these conversations and the sharings that people creatively offer in response to the stimuli of the material and the ideas you've expressed. and they go places that are very creative. And my hat's off to you, Neil, for developing a context where that kind of creativity and tacking, as in a sailboat, toward in forward progress can occur.
Thank you.
But I think the main value of it is in the sharing in response to the document.
Thank you. Francois, has this exercise, this material been useful and helpful to you?
Yes, very. W- I had the opportunity to read it before you edit this document, and I thought it was a very good complement to the original text. But when I have seen, well, I've heard the discussions and everything that turned around that document, it was more powerful than I thought in the first hand. It was better. It's so it's very relevant, very good.
Thank you. In effect, I believe you're giving a variation on Marvin's comment that the value was increased by our discussions. And what you found in this was reinforced by things that people shared.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. George, your views in general?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything that's been said. All of the questions that you came up with were thought-provoking, and the conversations were thought-provoking on top of that. So it's all been very enjoyable and stimulating.
Thank you very much. Bob, you, like Francois, were one of the reviewers who saw a draft of this text, and you've commented today on the value to you of various discussions that we've undertaken during the webinars that we've been discussing different parts of it. So do you have any additional thoughts that you'd like to add at this point?
There's a number of thoughts that come to mind. One is that when I first looked at it, I had no conception that we would take the total of webinars that we would do to actually go through these things. You know, sometimes we spent an entire webinar on a paragraph, for example. Rightly so, and as George has said, extremely stimulating. What it's forced me to do is to go back and take a look at some of the material that I needed to look at to understand certain topics, like the cultist idea. And it turned out that during the COVID-19 time, JSTOR, which is the JSTOR, which is it's the big kahuna, it's the mother, it's the Akashic records of all the journals, and it goes back as far as 1830 or so. And it occurred to me, and we've talked about this a little bit in one of the webinars, that there was some tremendous thought, deep thought, that pushed the religious envelope, that pushed the theology, that pushed the religion of authority versus the religion of spirit concepts between 1870 and 1930, of course, in 1935 or so, when the papers became indicted. Andre made a statement just a minute ago that, what is about the null hypothesis? What if we didn't have the revelation? And it almost occurred to me, thinking about this great compendium of journal documents that I'm finding stimulating, to say the least, to be able to add to some, how did humans come to these thought patterns, that the revelation was able to then put cosmic perspective around it, and then give us, give it to us from the I am all the way to the consummator of the universe destiny. I mean, that's just amazing for a planet that's so out of sync that it's hardly believable that even a Trinity teacher son would even tell us much more about paradise than we have in the Revelation. So maybe human thought is much further along than we think. And maybe the revelation was almost required for various reasons. That may be one of them. It was a thought that I just had. So yeah, the document is extremely stimulating. And in fact, its value is that we have all of these webinars and all this discussion that hopefully others will take a look at and scratch their head and say, you know, I got to listen to that again, as I've done that before. I've had to go back and listen to even the week before when George said something that I couldn't write down fast enough. And I thought, gosh, I got to go ask George how he came up with those ideas, because they were quite insightful. And everyone has had these. Everyone that's been on the panel list. So thought-provoking, open-ended questions are really good. And one other quick thought, Andre, you came up with that null hypothesis. I was in a reading group recently, and we were studying the Moranchi experiences that or visitations that Jesus gave, 23 or so, I guess is what it was. And I asked someone, I said, well, what do you think would have happened if he didn't do this? If you know, the null hypothesis of that he never made any appearances. And I think to a person, there was some really interesting discussion, and everyone thought it really wouldn't be very good. So maybe this revelation, as you say, has been required for various and sundry reasons that we hardly know yet. Our unrevealed destiny, I suppose. Neil, back to you.
Thank you. And indeed, I will now recognize Andre, who will probably be the last speaker unless I get some urgent request for additional coverage. Andre, you have commented about the context of this material as, in effect, a reinforcement for readers of the Urantia book. And my intention is indeed that. I was trying, when I wrote this, to give a broader, more complex, perhaps, hopefully more insightful view of the different dimensions of the true teachings of Jesus. And if it has served that purpose, then I am quite happy. I do not know whether you wish to react to that statement.
Well, I'll just simply state that I agree with what everybody else has said, and that you know, these are in some ways, they could be looked at as very esoteric dialogues, in that the audience is very narrow currently. But I think if we believe in our revelation, we understand that others like ourselves are going to be very, very interested in these questions to a larger and larger extent. And to the extent that this lays groundwork for people to later consider these ideas that they may not as easily get to themselves, to that extent, we're extending the road, we're building the bridge, we're moving things forward. I don't state that in any kind of pretentious way. I rather try to state that in a sense that we have faith in our revelation, that it's going to appeal to more and more people. And to the extent that it appeals to more and more people, eventually there will be more and more people that have the same kinds of questions that have been expressed by you. Very, very well developed, good thinking that will help them perhaps to come up with the creative ideas that will bridge this revelation to others. And that's really what's the long and the short of it. Let's hope that our revelation by this and by many other means is bridged to a wider and wider swath of humanity.
Thank you, Andre. That's a very, very positive and constructive conclusion. I share your hope. I certainly believe that this is the direction that the revelators had in mind. For that matter, I believe it is likewise the direction that Michael had in mind in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth. So the midwayers have told us that his teachings will not remain unfruitful. They will eventually be very fruitful in the hearts of men. And if we can contribute to that to some slight degree, some minor degree, then that is all to the better. So gentlemen, thank you for participating today. I should say procedurally, we have concluded discussion of this document. We will now, in our next webinar, return to the main document, Revelation Revealed, specifically to the bottom of page 109 of Revelation Revealed, which is still part of topic 8. There is a single paragraph labeled monasticism. We will read that very quickly. I will read it very quickly. I have identified 4 segments of part 4 of the Urantia book that I will set before the participants next week as a brief introduction to the topic of monasticism. And then after that, in phase 9 of our discussions, we will go more deeply into the details of monasticism, all of which will be explained. But in any case, next week, we return to Revelation Revealed, page 109, the paragraph on monasticism. And I think many of you will be part of that discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good to be with you all.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Neil.
Thank you. Bye-bye.